The Azarovs Realm has by far some of the best Huntress maps in Dead by Daylight. They provide great line of sight, have fun tiles, and are overall very satisfying to play on. Today, we're going to go over some advanced tricks and shots you can use the next time you load into an Azarov game. If you're newer to Huntress, this may not be the best video for you, but I have some other great guides you can go check out on my channel. I'm going to go over every shot on every tile and map for this realm. Each shot is going to be given 3 different scores on a scale of 1 to 5. The difficulty score measures how hard it is to actually land the shot, regardless of if there's a survivor there or not. The predictability score is how obvious it is that a survivor can tell what you're going for. And finally, the opportunity score covers how many times you'll actually have a chance to go for these shots when the survivor is at these tiles. So to start things off, I want to talk about some of the generic tiles and structures that can be found on every map. Since Wrecker's Yard and Azarov's Resting Place don't have main buildings with any shots, this can serve as a guide for those maps. Starting off with one of the most popular tiles, the shack has some boarded up windows on it that can be used from a number of different angles to completely bamboozle survivors. I have a lot of fun tricks at shack, so drop a comment if you want to see a shack specific guide. Many of the walled structures and tiles on Azarov maps are actually relatively low and can be thrown over the top of. Many of the rocks, tires, and pickup trucks can be thrown over. Anything that looks roughly survivor height can be an opportunity to hit a hatchet. These are very useful for when survivors are mostly in the open because you know they're going to dodge towards the cover. A few of the jungle gym tiles on Azarov spawn this really nice hole, but be careful because it's not as easy to hit as it looks. The stairs and railings around the crane are actually quite tricky to use properly, but in some circumstances, they can land you some nice hits. If survivors have a bit of distance on you and are going towards the crane vault, you can usually try a shot through the cabin. This extremely fun crane shot used to be in the game, but unfortunately is not currently possible. I wanted to include this anyway, since I suspect the devs might fix the hitbox. This gap on the bed of the pickup with the engine is actually much harder to hit than it looks, but the timing's relatively consistent. The windows of the broken car don't have any glass in them, so they can be thrown through. This dumpster tile is quite annoying to work around, but with this gap that exists, it makes it a little bit easier. Between the 2 buses where the God Vault sometimes spawns, there's a nice gap where you can use to hit survivors on the other side of the tile. There's also the opportunity to shoot a hatchet through the driver's side window of the bus, but the opportunity is quite rare. And finally, there's a small hole on the back of the bus that can either be used to catch survivors who just vaulted or are running around the tile. On these tiles that spawn on the outside of the map, there's a gap to the side of the pallet towards the ground that you can throw through. This gap on the filler tile here is quite obvious, but it should be used almost every time you're at this tile. This next shot on the 4 lane is not at all obvious, so I wanted to give a close-up view first. I wish it was more common, but really the only way to hit this is when you first rotate to the tile. On the relatively new tile that resembles a 4 lane, there's a gap next to some of the lockers that you can just barely squeeze a hatchet through. If you aim low under the front of the dump truck, you can hit survivors that have just that tiny bit of extra distance on you. Aiming through the window of the cabin of the dump truck allows you to get some unique angles on survivors holding forward. Some of these car walls that spawn have gaps in them that in some rare circumstances can be used to throw through. I'm honestly not even sure if this is possible anymore, and it's definitely not practical, but maybe you'll find yourself one day in a position where you can try shooting through the cars on the crane. And finally, there's absolutely no way anyone is going to hit this shot, but there's this nice little gap on the teal wall that I wanted to include. Alright, and next let's talk about Blood Lodge. With main building recently being moved to the center of the map, these shots definitely come up a lot more often now. So starting off, most players probably don't even know this crack exists, let alone that you can throw through it. Your best bet is probably going to be catching survivors rotating towards main from the outside. This shot is quite similar to the one at Shack, but it's not quite as easy to set up. This balcony shot is quite predictable, but you'd be surprised at how many survivors just let you try this anyway. There's this really nice gap behind the gen on main where you can catch survivors as they rotate inside. This shot really doesn't come up that often, but it's definitely a nice tool to have in your arsenal. And finally, I threw this in there for fun, but there's this nice little hole you can hit on the roof of main. Alright, and next up is Gas Heaven, which unfortunately doesn't have a lot of unique shots, but is still a fun map. First up, these windows on main can be good to catch survivors off guard that are running around the outside without paying attention. This one's pretty easy to see coming, but a lot of survivors will use this sign as a last resort. The shelves inside of main are just low enough to where you can shoot over them if you have enough distance. And finally, while this isn't exactly a shot, I think it's important to know that you can't shoot through these gaps. And finally, we have Wretched Shop, which has by far some of the most satisfying shots you can hit. Survivors almost never see any of these coming. First of all, let's start with a shot that, to my knowledge, has the exact same hitbox as the boarded windows on Shack. Survivors usually have a bit more distance here, so they tend to expect this a little less often. This hole on the back of main seems like it was specifically made for Huntress. It's rare to hit, but extremely satisfying. The tires around the outside of main do a really good job convincing survivors that they're safe, when in reality they're not. And finally, similar to Blood Lodge, there's a nice cute little hole on the top of main that you can shoot sky hatchets through.
Alright, and those are most of the shots that I'd recommend every Huntress player knows for Azarovs. If I left off any shots, chances are it was either too obscure or difficult, or too simple for me to include. If you want to see a similar guide for a different realm, drop a comment down below with the name of the realm. You can subscribe if you want to see more Huntress content, or follow me on Twitch where I'm live every Friday night.